All right, it's time for another Countdown to Classic interview with the devs, and a very different kind of interview for the show, considering our classic content. We're talking retail today, and we're here with one of the big kahunas from retail, Morgan Day. Morgan, mate, how are you?
Hey, how's it going? Nice to
I'm
meet you, Josh.
good. It's nice to meet you too. Real quick for all my, classic fans out there. Well, Morgan, I'll let you introduce yourself. I called you one of the big kahunas. Why don't you talk yourself up? Who are you? What do you do on retail?
Hey, my name is Morgan Day. I am one of the associate game directors on World of Warcraft, primarily taking point on the War Within and other odds expansions. But I've been at Blizzard. I want to say this year is my 20th anniversary at Blizzard. So I've been playing World of Warcraft basically since like Alpha 1. I want to say the level cap was like 4
Hmm.
when I started playing, and then working on it kind of ever since launch.
Very good, very good. Well, I'm very excited to have you here. I'll throw in a quick joke that you don't need to comment on, but again, for my classic listeners, if you don't know, I mean, I've heard for years uh, about Morgan, like, oh, this is the month. I think Morgan's going to become the director soon. I think movements are afoot. It's going to be Morgan. It's going to be Morgan, and nothing ever happens. It's always status quo. But I've heard that stuff for years and years and years. But anyway, only reason I say that is just to iterate the fact that Morgan is definitely one of the people you want to be talking to about retail. So, guys, look, let's get into it. Morgan, mate, healing. Let's talk about healing just for a little bit going into 11.1. I'm sure it's not news to you that the healers out there have had a bit to say about the war within so far. But it's one of those things where I play healer. And I was originally one of the skeptics. Well, not skeptics, but I was like, yeah, healing's too hard. This is bullshit, blah, blah, blah. Then I just kind of took people's advice and got better, or get good, as they say. And it did ease a bit of that pressure, and I learnt the role and figured it out. However, I would still say that I think some of the healers' complaints are justified in the pressure that role carries in modern World of Warcraft. Are you personally happy with where the healing role is at, like maybe particularly in Mythic Plus, moving into 11.1?
With all things, class balance is definitely one of those things that is an art and is constantly evolving, changing. Also, I think you mentioned Mythic Plus. There's a lot of different elements of healing. From raids and different raid difficulties, right? From normal to heroic to mythic, and then even within Mythic Plus, when you ask them, well, what key are you actually healing? Because that has huge implications as well. I will say, like, very high level, philosophically, we've heard a lot of feedback about health bars essentially rubber banding, right? And that's
Mm.
very much something that I have felt change over time. We make changes, even going into the War Within, we've made major changes to like player health and creature damage
Mm.
to try to address some of these things. But ultimately, yeah, the way I've phrased this to the team at times is it feels like I'm playing a DPS spec where you have like a rotation as a healer. Um, but if I mess up my rotation, someone dies.
Yeah.
Like it is really can feel quite stressful at times, depending on the difficulty of the content you're pushing. So, yeah, I mean that's absolutely something that the team has heard feedback on, and ultimately, philosophically, we want to move in a direction where it doesn't feel like I just said, like that DPS rotation, but as a healer. But those are types of changes that will take it's something that we're going to move in that direction over time. Swinging the pendulum too quickly could
Mm.
really, be a bit, could cause a bit of whiplash for our
Mm.
player base. So it's something that, with an end goal in sight,
Yeah.
we're going to make changes to constantly make progress in
Well,
that direction. Things like raid cooldowns being required at very specific times, and all the healers feeling like they have so many raid cooldowns.
mm.
I've actually been healing quite a bit during season one,
Okay.
and have felt that kind of gluttony of like, I have so many
Yeah.
raid cooldowns. What do I do with all these?
Well, that's what I was kind of getting at, and obviously, I appreciate that you can't really answer, and I don't want to tie you down to an answer that you give now for the next expansion. But in sort of picking up in the subtleties in that answer, could it ever be the case that in the next expansion, is healing too big, or is the role too defined, or is it just too hard to sort of announce, hey, in WoW's next expansion, we've completely redesigned healing? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny. I've joked please don't take this as we're gonna do this in WoW. But I play a ton of different MMOs, and a lot of different MMOs really struggle with the Trinity, right? Tank,
Yes.
heal, DPS.
Yep.
And I've seen other MMOs try different things. I've seen some MMOs like, oh, there's no tank class, like everyone just DPSs, and that ends up with interesting behavior. But I've played a couple MMOs where there's just no healer, right? You're just responsible for your own health bar, and those are actually really fun. Not to say that that's something we will or could or should do in World of Warcraft. It's
Mm.
just a fun, like, kind of philosophical conversation
I
and example to look at. Um, I will say though, one of the major goals actually in Dragonflight, we added augmentation.
mm,
And that was something I felt really strongly about, was adding a role that was for a segment of the player base that really just loves to kind of like support their friends, right? Like they know they're not the best player in the world. They're not gonna, have orange parses, but they just want to help people out. And in WoW, previous to the addition of augmentation, healing was frankly the only ground to go to, right? If you're that player who wants to support people, well, I'm gonna heal. And as you've mentioned, in some cases, and in depending on the difficulty or the content you're playing, it can at times be fairly stressful.
mm,
So having an option that could fill that role of feeling like you're supporting your team, but not responsible for the health bars of your team
mm.
in such a direct manner, was one of the main goals of adding augmentation, and that has been kind of fun to look at and reflect on.
Okay. I wish I had a sip of coffee in my mouth when we talked about the notion of deleting healers so I could do the spit take. But, all a bit of fun. I get where you're coming from. It's a good start. We're off to deleting healers and Org Evokers catching strays. So it's a good start. Good
Exactly.
stuff. Exactly.
Exactly.
Mate, just real quick, just very, very quickly before I move on to the next topic, you mentioned just the rubber banding. Look, you guys play the game. It's two. You mentioned you've been healing a bunch this season. As devs, with the rubber banding, you see the commentary on the forums and subreddit and whatnot. Look, honestly, does it give you, sorry to be crass for a second, does it kind of give you guys the shits too?
I wouldn't use that language. Ultimately, as someone who has been playing and working on World of Warcraft for so long, we fully understand and recognize just kind of like the passion and excitement that our community has for the game, right? This is something that, is near and dear to them. This is people's escape. This is where you can go to really feel like you have a community and a game where you belong. And we take that to heart, right? We always want to build, an exciting world where players can explore new spaces, like the Undermine coming up very shortly, where players can get, kind of go and enjoy their communities that they built over time. So we understand it comes from a place of passion and excitement and love. And our team feels the same way, right? Like there are no bigger critics of the game than our own team itself. We constantly are talking about, what we can do to improve. It's I always say it's exciting to come into work on Monday because there's always people who are, discussing on, I guess nowadays it's Slack, people
Mm.
discussing things on messengers and talking about ways that we can improve the game or things that we want to focus on moving forward. So, yeah, it at times can, speaking of stress, be stressful, but ultimately it really energizes us and, gives us that motivation to constantly be improving and making something that our players love.
All right. Look, I'll let you off the hook. Aramis and Alex will have a laugh because I know that answer was straight out of the handbook. The PR people are very happy with that one, but they know that I get a bit fidgety when I get the canned answers. But that's okay, Morgan. We're just getting to know each other, mates. Let me ask, Season 1 Mythic Plus, did it meet your personal expectations?
Uh, it depends on which part we're talking about. I can break down the different pieces of that, I guess. So we made a pretty big swing with the War Within Season 1, where we really tried to kind of condense the number of keystone levels,
Mm-hmm.
as well as create kind of this idea of like there's the Mythic Plus keys up to a certain power level, like Keystone Hero, where there's all these awesome affixes. But then we recognize that there's an audience in World of Warcraft who really like to push high level keys, who don't want to, have so much variance week over week that kind of can help can kind of dictate, whether or not they can push for the highest rating that week. So we kind of tried to delineate those two experiences and treat them a little bit differently. um, and that element of it we feel was pretty successful. But something that I think, um, we've already are going into season 2. You know, there's a big blog post that came out recently that kind of were discussing some of our goals with season 2. But one of the things that I think was the I don't know how else to phrase this other than, you know, when we did squish the levels of Mythic Plus keys, it essentially got double squished for that lower level. You know, instead of feeling like the Mythic Plus progression was from 2 to 10 or 2 to 11, depending on what you want to do, it was kind of like 7 and 10, right? Like that progression got really condensed, and that was something that we're really focusing on for season 2, is to make sure that that progression from the beginning, making sure there's a clean on ramp into the higher keystone levels, um, is a bit more fluid, and making changes like making Mythic Plus, oh sorry, making Mythic Zero. We really should come up with a better name for that. There's Mythic and then Mythic Plus, but the Mythic Plus starts at 2
Right.
for reasons.
It is very awkward for a new player. I was a new retail player, and
Yes,
it was weird. Yeah.
yes, exactly. We should come up with a better nomenclature there. But Mythic Zero actually will drop higher item level gear and go back to having a weekly lockout.
Mhm.
For so that that is a place that can feel like a bit more of like a training wheels kind of stomping ground for players who want to dip their toe into Mythic Plus. And then Mythic Plus, as you are in the early keystone levels, will just go back to having the default kind of no affix
Yeah.
experience. We kind of think as the timer itself existing as almost an affix in itself, so it doesn't need to have that additional pressure of like the seasonal or the Zalatat's bargains
Mm.
or fortified or tyrannical. So ultimately, there's been a lot of changes that have happened there. I also think there's been a lot of really great changes that have actually already come into the game that some players that might have played season 1 haven't seen themselves. That if they're returning for season 2, hopefully will be a happy surprise. There was a lot of rewards changes that happened in our 1107 update where things like crests would scale higher depending
Mm-hmm.
on the difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we were seeing and really wanted to try to address there was, say you're someone who just wants to get, you know, some of the gilded crests for the week, it would be more efficient for you to do a lower keystone level than maybe what you were capable of doing. And ultimately what might happen there is that, you know, player who's potentially overgeared for like a mythic +8 was kind of taking the spot of someone who where that was, you know, maybe the difficulty that they were more um, you know, more accurate for them. So we're trying to make sure that it's always rewarding and the
Mm.
most efficient thing to push the keystone that, you know, is appropriately difficult for you, rather than kind of going down in tiers, which should hopefully help a
Okay.
lot with the pug scene. So that was very much something that we also wanted to try to address. So there's been a tremendous amount of changes. We always look to make them, you know, kind of as quickly as we can, get those out to the players as, you know, and you know, as quickly as we can. So we will often make those changes, especially with things like rewards, or even, you know, live tuning for
Mm.
some of our classes,
Mm.
just ASAP. But then there's some changes that we feel like are more appropriate. We call it kind of on seasonal boundaries,
Okay.
and kind of a massive rescale of how the dungeons are actually, how difficult they are. Something that we felt was more appropriate for a seasonal boundary.
All right. I've got 3 follow-up questions for you, Morgan, from that one, and I think
Love it.
all of them are going to make you squirm a little bit. But you know, you can always plead the fifth if you want. Look, I appreciate that was a great setup to these questions, so thank you for answering that. But to sort of point you more in the direction of where I was going there, real quick, in light of the fact that you're always looking to improve, what would you give season 1 out of 10? You played it.
Uh, what would I give it out of 10? What's my scale? Right? Like, have we had
The
a 10?
the usual one. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I just started playing retail when The War Within came out, so I've got nothing to compare it to. If you don't want to
I would
answer, you don't have to
say,
answer.
nah, I mean, I would say that there's always room for improvement, but I was really happy with, you know, I'm not sure if you followed a lot of the feedback going into the War Within, but there was a lot of uh, feedback and let's just call it consternation.
Hmm.
Uh, also, hi to all the people who are now playing Modern along with you. I fully invite your
Yeah,
community to come check it out.
we are a
There's lots of fun
crowd.
stuff
We
always going
exist.
on.
My listeners are shocked that I'm still playing retail, and I'm like, why? It's a good MMO. The War Within
Yeah.
for me changed things.
And you know, you can play both. Also,
Yes,
it's always
absolutely.
fun to
Absolutely.
experience what is
Yeah.
constantly coming out. I know there's a lot of
Yeah.
fun stuff happening in
Yeah.
Classic today,
So back on the hot seat,
with
you were
Cataclysm.
saying
So,
about your
anyways,
grade.
uh, I feel like given the feedback that we got going into the War Within,
Mm,
there was a lot of major changes that happened super late with things like the Xalatath affixes coming in,
mm-hmm,
and those were really successful in hindsight, right? Like that
mm,
was something that we were trying a lot of different things with, let's just call it limited success leading up to the launch, and the team I think really knocked it out of the park coming into launch. So with that in mind, and also all the things that I just mentioned, where there was a couple misses with the early progression and a couple misses on the reward side, I would say like a 7.5, 8. I
okay,
feel like is
fair
probably
enough.
good.
Well, on that note, here's the next follow-up question that'll again further push your PR training because you're doing so well, Morgan. Look, I think you've just alluded to it and taken a bit of the pressure off of me in how to softly word this question or word it politely. Like I said, I'm a first time retail player. This is my first Mythic Plus season. I'm on the record multiple times to my listeners saying I've never engaged with Mythic Plus before, and this is the greatest thing to ever happen to MMOs. I love it. I can't stop running them. I think it's so amazing. Kudos to you guys. But
Thank you.
that's the only experience I've ever had, right? There's obviously a lot of veterans that have been running it for years, blah, blah, blah. There has now look, let me balance this. There's a lot of positive talk out there about season one, but I read a lot of the subreddit and the forums, and there has been a notable amount of commentary about look, if you've played Mythic Plus for some time, this season was euphemistically a letdown, right? Now, what I'm going to throw to you is though, do you feel as a dev when you read that kind of commentary that it's just old hat? Because it seems to, there's always someone complaining every season about something, oh, it's just the same old, same old. Or was there something about War Within season one that actually had you maybe reading a bit deeper into that feedback?
Yeah, it's funny. There's another kind of popular podcast that put out an episode recently that was like at the start of the War Within, they came out with a podcast that says Blizzard saves Mythic Plus, and then
Mm.
just a couple weeks ago it was Blizzard saves Mythic Plus in parentheses again, and I got a giggle out of that. um, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, a lot of that feedback um, and sentiment is something that we always have to listen to, right? We can't just say, "Hey, we know better."
Yeah. Oh, WoW players
I
being
think
WoW
that
players, right?
well, it's really interesting, right? Like I talk about this a lot, like going back to Shadowlands.
Mm.
The team really did have a pretty big philosophical shift about, essentially really wanting to meet players where they are, listen to feedback, and make changes that maybe, I've said I've been on this team a long time. I've seen kind of the way the World of Warcraft team has changed, the leadership team has changed, the way that we approach developing World of Warcraft has changed over time. And, you kind of come up in the studio on the team, kind of being essentially taught certain philosophies. And it's really hard to take that huge step back and be like, all right, uh, it remi- it reminds me of the that Simpson meme, like, am I out of touch or the
Or
kids
is
out
it
of
the
touch? Nah,
children?
it
Yeah,
must be
exactly.
the
Yeah.
children, right? There's a lot of reflecting that happens, and in Shadowlands there was a huge kind of philosophical shift that we've been really trying to lean into ever since. And the way I phrase it is just kind of meet players where they are, and
Yeah.
if there's feedback about things that they're not enjoying, then there's something to that, right? And it's our job to understand the core of that and really get down and drive into what's causing that feedback. You hear things like Mythic Plus isn't fun, and as a developer, you're like, all right, well, that could literally mean anything. What does that actually mean? And it's
Yeah.
it's it's part of the job is to get to the core of it, to try to understand where that's coming from, and then how we can make improvements on it moving forward. And that's ultimately, what our focus has been. And with something like Mythic Plus, like you even said yourself, and I'm curious to ask you a question,
Mm.
which you can get to in a minute. But
Hmm.
when did you first start playing WoW? Because you've mentioned retail,
I started
but
in
what is you got to get?
'06. Yeah, so I'm your classic. I'm probably I don't know, the marketer's wet dream, if you will, for why Classic was brought about in a way, in that I played from '06 to 2010, 2011, dipped out at the start of Kata, which seems to be a relatively common theme that you hear, and then returned for Classic. And then, having played Classic all these years, wasn't grabbed by Shadowlands, Battle for Azeroth, or I did enjoy Dragonflight, but just barely played it. But something really felt different about War Within and hooked me in.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I'm really happy, and maybe some of those philosophy shifts we're talking about is what led to that. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's the job, right? Is
Hmm.
to try to keep things fresh, try to keep things novel, listen to player feedback, and meet them where they are, and often try to find solutions that might be creative and find ways to achieve our goals while also, kind of making the community happy.
Okay. Mate, Delves, the 6 month review, real quick. Look, this is an interesting one because I was very excited to hear about the concept of Delves, and I think they're great. I think they're wonderful. New content, sorry, more content is always a good thing. The thing I've always wondered with Delves from your perspective as a dev and from the team's perspective is, you know, it's interesting covering classic and we have all these conversations about, game dev philosophy and everything and what's right for MMOs. Should it be a push towards group content? Should it be a push towards, should your MMO have individual content and all that stuff? Does the data suggest at this stage for you guys at the 6 month phase with Delves that solo content is something gamers want as part of their MMO experience? And I'm sorry, I'm going to weave in 2 or 3 questions into this one. It's just me being an idiot. And how do you personally feel about that push and pull between solo and group content in modern MMOs? I say that because we hear about something like, Ashes of Creation in their alpha. The rumors are everywhere that, they really push you into group play. Like it's a bit of a weird game when you're alone. And so I just wonder how, modern devs feel about that.
Um, that's such an interesting question because I think if you ask this team that question over the course of 20 years, you would get different answers, right?
Mm.
That's kind of the interesting thing about World of Warcraft in particular is it's a game that I should look this up. I'm not actually sure. I can ask Aramis or Alex later. Of just like it's been going for a long time. And like I just said, we want to meet the community where they are and provide them with opportunities to play the game in the way that they're excited to
Mm.
play it, right? Like that was one of the things that we talked about a lot in Shadowlands is there was essentially rewards were driving players to feel like they were required to do things
Mm.
that they didn't want to do. So ultimately our goal is to, give players a suite of content that is
Mm.
exciting and compelling to play and then let them kind of
Mm.
choose. It's one of the
But
best parts about that I love about modern World of Warcraft is there's so much content in the game and you can only play like 10-15% of it and feel like there's just endless
yeah,
content for you, whether that's PvP or delves or Mythic Plus or raiding. It's kind of a menu of options that you kind of can choose from.
but
And
but
with
are the
the
numbers?
addition,
Sorry to interrupt. I want to
no, go
I
for it.
want to rip this tangent away and
Sure,
just
sure,
get
sure.
do sorry, not that that wasn't a tangent, but I get what you're saying. But do the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
numbers suggest that you guys were fully vindicated in introducing this content to the game? You're like, oh my god, everyone's doing delves.
There's delves are very popular. I
Okay,
can't share
no,
specific
no, no,
numbers,
no, but
but
just the
delves are very
vibe.
popular, right?
Yeah,
And
okay.
and there are definitely, and from what we've seen, there's lots of different audiences within World of Warcraft, like I was just alluding
Yep,
to.
yep.
But specifically, there are definitely people who love the outdoor world. They love questing content, and I always joke, that world quest that you do right when you hit max level is no harder, a week, a month later when you've got way better gear, right? So if you're a player who loves that content, doesn't really have time or is stressed out by group content,
Hmm.
um, and you want to have a bit more of a challenge, delves provide you with that challenge. And
Mhm.
you said you mentioned you check Reddit a lot. Like I think every week see people posting, they're killing hard mode Zekvir, and they're
Yeah,
like,
I
oh,
think
I've never done something this
that's all they
hard
post now on the
in World
subreddit.
of
Yeah,
Warcraft, right? But it's like, hey, that's awesome.
yeah,
That's a person who this is content that now provides them with a new challenge, a new goal that
yep.
they can chase. Um, and there are some people for sure that were playing Mythic Plus, and maybe that wasn't actually what they wanted to do, but because they wanted the highest gear level rewards, that was the only option. So Delves now provides um, alternatives for that player type. So in ultimately to reflect and to answer your question, yes, we think delves have been really popular. We very much want to continue to support them and are really happy with the data, as you
Fantastic.
phrased it.
I'm really, really happy that Brand gets a tank spec in the next patch. I was a little shocked to see it wasn't there at the start, but so glad it's being put in now because, I mean, I just want to heal delves. That'll be fantastic. So good stuff there. Mate, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to rip through these last couple. I'll cull a bunch
Sure,
of...
sure.
You're lucky. I'm culling a lot of the hard ones as well. So,
Okay.
mates, look, just real quick, I know, again, you can't really give us too much of a peek behind the curtain, but just, I know this is an 11.1 chat, this is much further down the road, but the player housing that's being worked on at the moment, just from your perspective, I'd love to know, you know, initially it's a feature that is a part of some other MMOs, very famous in Final Fantasy 14. You guys are trying to bring your own spin to it, which I think is fantastic. There was, I think, a light ribbing as well in the notion that you mentioned recently that, you're not going to keep houses from people. They're going to be available to everyone. That's great. All I want to ask is, are you happy? Well, actually, let me rephrase. Are you happy with how the development of player housing is coming along? And I've felt a shift in the vibe towards it, where initially I think there was a lot of, old school WoW players going, "Oh, why are we wasting development time on this? Rabble, rabble, rabble." And now I think
Who was saying that?
well, it was out there. I mean, but I think the tide is shifting now, because my big thing has been, boys and girls, the future of MMOs is customization. It's aesthetic customization. That's what gamers want to do in their games, whether you like it or not. It's the wave of the future. You guys leaning into that, and I think people are more coming on board with, actually, WoW housing could be kind of cool. How's it going, the development of it all?
Yeah, I mean, you just spoke to customization, and that's something we talk a lot about, which is just your ability to express yourself within World of Warcraft. Identity is something that a lot of players connect to within World of Warcraft, be it with their, characters, their pets, if they're hunters, their transmog, and giving players new ways to express themselves in the game is always something that we are looking for opportunities for. And you mentioned it yourself. There's a lot of information in that blog. I'm not going to add
No.
any
Yeah,
more
it speaks for
color
itself.
than what
Yep.
was in there. But yeah, I mean, we're truly, really excited.
Yeah.
It's something that has been speculated and
Okay.
and frankly requested
Okay.
for how many years, and the
Are
fact that we can actually bring that to
are
players is
things
awesome.
on pace for the launch of the next expansion to have player housing?
I think that's something that there will be continuous updates
Okay.
about the
All right.
progression of housing, and we'll
All
give
right.
players some more sneak peaks
Very
in the
good.
coming days. But yeah, I can't share too much about
No.
that
All good. All good.
with the Undermine update.
Okay, real quick. Rumors are afoot of a UI update involving something akin to Weakauras. I'm not sure if you guys have officially said anything, but stuff is out there. Look, if you were to do this, would the plan be to how do I say this? Are you trying to effectively, not that this is a thing, but put Weakauras out of business? Or is this just something easy and for beginners to use if they want to? Or are we leaning into Weakauras harder than ever in future content?
Uh, Wow, that's a big question in the last minute here. Let me see how to unpack that one. I mean, ultimately, our goal with World of Warcraft is to always make sure that players can enjoy and be successful in World of Warcraft without any add-ons. We think add-ons are one of the more interesting elements of World of Warcraft. It's quite unique in the MMO space. We were just talking about identity and players being able to customize their UI in fun ways. I remember going back and looking at like Race for World first videos from the old days. There was someone that had like a My Little Pony UI, and I always get a laugh about that. But we're always looking to provide players with the best experience with the default UI. I can't speak to specifics of future updates in terms of add-ons or add-ons or UI updates that are not in the Undermined patch, but there are cool UI features in this patch. Like actually, I'm not sure if you saw, but there's a new event scheduler
Right.
where you can actually look and find a lot of the events that are up in the world, because we've heard a lot of feedback in the past about how, hey, there's all this cool stuff happening and I have to Google it essentially to find out what's available right now, where to go, what does it reward. Those are always things that we hear questions about, and we're always looking to improve the default World of Warcraft experience that essentially comes out of the box. And being able to effectively play your class is something that we've also heard a lot of feedback on from our players, and how they would appreciate other tools. So that's very much feedback that we are taking to heart, and maybe in the not too distant future, you could hear something about that, but nothing to announce specifically today.
Okay, last 30 seconds. The guys will, I'm sure, appreciate that I will wind this up. Look, this is the last one, tough one. Quickly, look, you mentioned the Crest overhaul before. Just in regards to that one, when there's a simple, like, on the face of it, tweaking of the numbers to a system like that, you're not changing content per se. It's just, oh, we'll have these rewards drop here in X amount, blah, blah, blah. That was called for some time through Mythic Plus. Why is it that sometimes changes like that do seem to be quite late? Is it like a House of Cards type situation, or what's the deal?
I mean, feedback is always evolving, right? Like that's something that initially the feedback was about when you get Gilded Crest, which actually I feel like the team is really quick to respond to some of these things. And it goes back a little bit to the answer that I was talking about previously, where sometimes there are solutions that we can pretty quickly just send a hotfix off, and sometimes they're a lot more complex, and there's actually a lot of nuance, and it is a bit of a house of cards. So if you tweak one number here, there's lots of ramifications. We want to make sure we get it right and provide players with the best experience. So those things often or sometimes are better to release with a seasonal boundary, but we're always
Yeah.
looking to make improvements whenever we can.
Okay. No, it's a great change, and it makes sense that, if it's got to be implemented at the start of the new season, that's all good. I can't wait to get stuck into it. Morgan, mate, look, I'm like, it's like you can hear, I push and I push, and you did so well. I can't thank you enough, mate. You've been
Thank you,
wonderful.
Josh.
Thank you.
It's been great to meet you.
You
And,
too.
welcome to you and your community. Please join us on this awesome journey in the Undermine. Goblins are cool. There's cool stuff.
Absolutely. Looking forward to getting into the Goblin content, mate. I hope to speak to you again in the future. Have a great day.
You as well.